The YouTuber InspiringPhilosophy recently made a video arguing against abortion, and quite fittingly, this has inspired me to make my own video on the subject, where I will disagree with his main argument, which is the argument I've been wanting to address for a long time. So I will be using his video as kind of a springboard for my own thoughts on this general argument, but then I will go back and address some of the points that are more unique to his video. IP's argument, the one that I've been itching to address, is that fetuses are biologically humans, which therefore makes it immoral to kill them. As usual, his full video is linked in the description below, but here are some excerpts highlighting this argument.
Well, the reasons are none other than ethical and above all scientific. All the evidence demonstrates quite easily that human life begins at conception, not at birth. According to everything science has revealed, this is just as much of a human as this is. I could cite dozens of papers that all point out the obvious thing. Life begins at conception. Life begins at conception. Life begins at conception, at conception, at conception, at conception, and on I could go. There is not a scientific paper out there that says life begins later on or at birth. Life begins at conception, and nothing the pro-abortion community can offer provides any reason that this unborn child doesn't have a right to life like the rest of us.
Did you notice something different about that last clip? If not, it's alright, that's what we're about to examine. Before we address IP's argument, let's first try to understand what question we're actually looking to answer in the debate over abortion. Quite ironically, InspiringPhilosophy strongly and repeatedly asserts that this is not a philosophical debate, but a scientific one.
Of course, when you bring this scientific evidence up to people who are okay with the murder of a child, they will ignore it and appeal to philosophy. Now, where have I seen this tactic before of ignoring science and appealing to philosophy? If it doesn't work with young Earth theories, it won't work here as well. But they try to say, well, a fetus is not a person. The genetic existence of a human may begin at conception, but it is not a person yet. But to do this would just be to make up an ad hoc definition. It is not relying on a scientific foundation or evidence.
Well, it depends what the question is that we're ultimately looking to answer. If the question is, how old is the Earth, or what type of rocks are we standing on, then yes, that is a scientific question, specifically a geology question. By the same token, if the question is a fetus a human, then yes, that is also a scientific question, specifically a biology and taxonomy question. However, that is not the question we are ultimately looking to answer in the debate over abortion. The question we're really interested in is whether or not a fetus has the right to life, as IP asserts to be the case in his video. Questions of rights are the domain of philosophy. This is important because the argument that IP makes in his video seems to be missing a key premise, and it's this premise that I take issue with, despite its convenient omission. Observant viewers may have already noticed what's missing from the clips I showed, or from IP's full video if you've watched it. He doesn't state this premise outright, but instead uses phrases like right to life, human, and person interchangeably, as demonstrated in the last clip in the first group of clips that I showed. The argument that seems to come across in his video is as follows. Fetuses exist, fetuses are biologically humans, therefore fetuses have rights. Now you'll notice that this isn't actually a sound argument. The conclusion does not follow from the premises. What I think he's actually arguing would go something like this. Fetuses exist, fetuses are biologically humans. If something is biologically a human, then it has rights. Therefore, fetuses have rights. InspiringPhilosophy probably skipped over this premise just because he didn't think it needed to be said. I mean, really, who would question the idea that humans have rights? What kind of sicko are you? I thought we all agreed on this. Well, it's true, it does sound very bad to question it, but we will be looking at some very odd types of humans in very odd situations that most people simply aren't considering when they say things like humans have rights and various other assertions about how we should treat people. For these discussions, it's useful to distinguish between humans, a biological classification, and persons, an ethical classification, which basically means an entity that at least has the right to life. For example, back in 2013, India officially defined dolphins as non-human persons, which, if nothing else, highlights the functional difference between the words human and person, with the former being a biological category and the latter being an ethical category having to do with rights. Now, as I said, I will be contesting the idea that being biologically human is sufficient to make something a person. Instead of this, I propose a different standard which basically says that an entity has rights when it is sufficiently conscious, feeling, and perhaps most importantly, and a product of those two things, capable of high levels of suffering. And fundamentally, I think that we humans invented the idea of rights as a safeguard against suffering, not as a moral foray into taxonomy. Unfortunately, and I must say this before we get started, debates about rights, morality, and what we should value do rarely seem to make much headway, if only for the simple reason of a potentially infinite regress of normative statements about normative statements. What should we say we should do, and so on, going backward. As such, it often comes down to simply caring about different things as your moral starting points. If you only care about fulfilling God's word, or about preserving the lives of biological humans, and that is what you define as what you ought to do, then you will be trenchantly at odds with someone like me who prioritizes conscious, intelligent suffering. That being said, the reason I'm making this video despite this impasse is because I think most people, when you get right down to it, agree with me and prioritize conscious, intelligent suffering, not taxonomy. With all that being said, let's finally get to the actual argument. If something is biologically a human, then it has rights. A similar argument was made in the opposite direction in the movie Planet of the Apes. The apes argued that because Taylor is not an ape, he therefore has no rights under ape law, despite the fact that he is clearly a conscious, feeling entity capable of suffering. And that's what makes the entire situation so unnerving, the fact that the apes don't assign rights based on consciousness and the capacity for suffering, but on what species an individual belongs to. Just like anti-abortion advocates.
At the very least, this man has the right to know whether there's a charge against him.
Objection! This exhibit is indeed a man. Therefore, he has no rights under ape law.
Dr. Zira, this is a man, is it not?
He is unlike any man you have ever seen, as we hope to prove.
Answer the question, Dr. Zira. Is it a man? Dr. Zira, in all fairness, you must admit that the accused is a non-ape and therefore has no rights under ape law.
Here's a thought experiment to really flesh this out. If we made contact with aliens, would anyone who opposes abortion on the grounds that a fetus is technically human, therefore it has rights, argue that these aliens are not technically human, so they don't have rights? Or would they suddenly start believing that it's not really about whether or not something is technically human, but it's actually about whether something is conscious, intelligent, and capable of suffering, as pro-choice people have maintained all along? Now at this point, the counter-argument could be made that being human is merely sufficient for something to have rights, but not necessary, and that consciousness is another sufficient condition for having rights. And this would solve the problem of having to choose between aliens and human fetuses as far as which one gets rights and which doesn't. You can have both. Of course, this does raise the question, well, what was the point of having the biological humans standard in the first place? But additionally, and perhaps more to the point, what about alien fetuses, which are neither technically human nor conscious? How would anti-abortion advocates protect them? At this point, I think the only route left would be to rehash one of the oldest arguments in this field, which is that a potential person is morally equivalent to a regular person. Of course, this opens a huge can of worms, not the least of which is the fact that potential people are lost every time a condom doesn't break, but I prefer to use what I've called the 5 years rock thought experiment to really flesh out this problem. The 5 years rock thought experiment goes like this. Imagine that I handed you a rock, and I say, right now, this is just a normal rock, nothing special about it, it's a rock. But 5 years from now, as long as it doesn't suffer any major damage or, shatter into a million pieces, 5 years from now, it will suddenly become conscious. It'll talk, it'll think, it'll feel, and then if you smash it, it'll be in horrible pain. But right now, it's just a stupid rock. Now imagine that someone did go and smash that rock before it reached the 5-year mark. Would they feel bad about it, knowing that it would have been conscious? Probably, and I can imagine that I would feel bad about smashing such a rock. But I can't seem to find any logical reason to feel that way. Nothing suffered, nothing felt pain. I may as well have smashed any random rock for all that actually happened as a result of my actions. In this way, I think that a potential person is not the same thing as an actual person. Now, you might be tempted to argue that because we feel bad about smashing the 5 years rock, that must mean it's a bad thing to do. I mean, why would we feel bad about it if it weren't? But, as IP himself mentions in his video, just because our gut tells us one thing, that doesn't mean it's the logical or moral choice. In his video, it's the fact that most people would save one baby over 100 embryos. And in my case, it's that most people would probably feel bad about smashing the 5 years rock. Consider another, more realistic situation, that of conjoined twins, specifically where you have one body and two heads, where an embryo simply started to split but then didn't. Do they only get one vote? Biologically, this is only one human, one body with one DNA pattern. In fact, show me a biology textbook which says that a two-headed organism is actually two different organisms. And think about this, a little morbid, but think about it. Suppose I went and chopped off one of these girls' heads. Would that be murder or just mutilation? After all, biologically speaking, it would still be just one living human. But, of course, that's not true. That would be murder, and the fact that we call it murder and the fact that each of these girls have their own rights, I think is strong evidence that rights follow the consciousness, not the biology. Indeed, if we were to go down a list of animals from most intelligent to least, we would see rights diminish along the way. Humans have all the rights, higher animals have at least anti-cruelty laws, lesser vertebrates like frogs might have some protections, I honestly don't know, and finally we have worms and bugs which have no rights. This seems to fit my model very well. As one final thought experiment, imagine that a baby was born with a fully functional body and fully functional autonomic nervous system, and with healthy living brain tissue, but absolutely no neural activity. For some reason, there are just no action potentials in the neurons in this baby's brain, and there never were, and there's no medically plausible way that there ever will be. And just for the sake of argument, imagine that this baby is kept alive in the hospital for 30 years, growing into what looks like a fully mature adult taking a nap. I would argue that, while our gut tells us otherwise, this is not a person with rights, any more than a tumor or a teratoma with human cells is a person with rights. Of course, looking at the human in the hospital bed, and it is undeniably biologically human, we would feel bad about the idea of killing it, and even disgusted by the thought of doing it harm, but I would argue that no one is in that bed, because no one is in that head.
When we talk about the value of life, we're not talking about the value of a heartbeat, we're talking about the value of experiencing life, living life, awareness. Terry Shiva was dead long before anybody pulled the plug, and a fetus, while it is as alive as a mass of cancer cells, under one definition, is not alive in the sense that it is not reasonably equivalent. Consider teratomas, which include organs, unique organs. How do you make that distinction?
Now let's look at Inspiring Philosophy's objection to my proposed standard of consciousness and suffering, that of sleeping and comatose people. And I do think this is a fairly good one.
Some say because the fetus is not conscious yet, it is not a person. And how do they know this? Because they do not have the experience or knowledge of you or me? Lack of knowledge doesn't mean someone is not a person. People in vegetative states have very low IQs, and no one says they are not persons. What about people in deep sleep? Do they cease to be persons just because they do not display signs of consciousness, then suddenly become persons when they wake up?
Perhaps the most clear-cut situation to begin with is that of brain-dead people. That is, people whose bodies are biologically alive, but whose brains and brain cells have died. Because I think personhood is properly defined by consciousness combined with emotional awareness, then I would say that brain-dead people are no longer people. They have died. I think it's fairly simple. Cases of deep sleep and comas, however, are different. People who are asleep can still feel pain and either respond to their environment by waking up or simply by incorporating those inputs into their dreams. And even in comatose people, there can be evidence of awareness and subdued consciousness. However, in cases of really severe comas, and indeed in cases of general anesthesia, I think a different argument needs to be made. By the consciousness standard, it would seem that these people are, for all practical purposes, not people anymore, and I don't think it can be logically argued that killing them in this state is wrong, without, of course, appealing to notions of future consciousness, which is something I criticize anti-abortion people for doing, You just cannot equivocate actual consciousness with potential consciousness. So, why then do I think that we still shouldn't kill people on strong anesthetics? Well, practical reasons really. If we had no moral, or perhaps more to the point, legal restrictions on killing anesthetized people, no one would want to have surgery, and we simply cannot afford to make surgery such a horrifying prospect. People do need to believe that they are safe, even if, morally speaking, they aren't. I admit this is not a very fulfilling response, but I still think it is a reasonable one. Okay, I think that just about covers it for this general argument. Now let's take a look at some of the points that are a little more unique to Inspiring Philosophy's video.
But they try to say, well, a fetus is not a person. The genetic existence of a human may begin at conception, but it is not a person yet. But to do this would just be to make up an ad hoc definition. It is not relying on a scientific foundation or evidence. It is just an ad hoc attempt to define what you want to be a person and not a person. And this doesn't prove anything. And this philosophical view can lead to very devastating consequences. One only needs to open a history book and see what happened the last time a group of people decided another group of people were not actually people and not worthy of life and liberty. When you just decide you get to define what is a person and what isn't, without a scientific or ethical foundation, you will open the door to some pretty terrible possibilities.
Okay, except that the pro-life position does have an ethical and scientific standard, that of conscious pain and suffering. The ethical foundation is to minimize conscious pain and suffering, and the scientific foundation is that we know how to measure the experience of pain. Incidentally, fetuses younger than around 24 weeks have not been shown to experience pain, nor would we expect them to given their neural development at that stage. In this way, the suffering standard clearly differentiates between a fetus and an enslaved human.
The difference between us is that I can feel pain. You don't even care, do you?
We don't get to simply just define what a person is based on how we feel. I propose an objective standard to decide this, and the only standard rational individuals can agree on would be science. And science is pretty obvious on what constitutes as human life.
Science is pretty clear on what a human is, but not on what a person is and the nature of rights. And this is because science is simply not in the business of providing ethical foundations, merely informing them. Your ethical foundation of something being biologically human fails for the reasons I've explained. Inspiring Philosophy then spends about 3 minutes of his video addressing the idea that personhood is linked to intentional action, and even by that standard a fetus would still be a person. But I can only really assume that this is some sort of straw man because I don't think I've ever heard of an abortion supporter actually defining a person this way.
So for instance, let's suppose we define a person to be someone who is capable of intentional action. Well, guess what? Science is not on the side of abortion advocates in this case either. Even though consciousness in fetuses is very hard to study, by 14 weeks of age, there is undeniable evidence that fetuses display intentions, and by definition, would be persons. So for instance, studies have found that fetuses have goal-directed intentional actions. Abortion advocates often counter by denying the science and claiming that these movements are not conscious, but are just reflexes, sort of like when one's knee is struck with a reflex hammer. But once again, the science is not on their side. In a 2010 study published in the Journal of PLOS Medicine, researchers analyzed the movement patterns of 14 old-week fetuses to determine whether they reached for their face, for their eyes, or towards their twin. They displayed a pattern consistent with intentional movement. The researchers found that the movement of the fetuses did have a phase of deceleration, which means they slowed their hands down incrementally as they reached their goal. When humans reach for an object, their hand has to decelerate as they reach out. For instance, when you reach for your eyes, if your hands do not decelerate, you could damage your eyes if your hand makes contact at full speed.
Oh yeah? Well, how about some single-celled intentional action? I mean, look at that white blood cell chasing after that virus thing, and I don't know what's going on down there, but clearly the one cell wants to eat the other, and yet none of them have any rights.
If I didn't know better, I'd think he was scared.
Aren't there also situations in which even abortion advocates themselves would say it is immoral to have an abortion? For instance, what if a fanatic mother prefers to have an abortion just because the fetus will grow up to be a girl? What if in the future it could be determined in the womb whether someone will grow up to be gay or straight? Wouldn't abortion advocates say that in those situations it is immoral for the mother to kill the gay fetus just because the mother doesn't want to have a child that's gay?
I think it could be argued that these people are not taking issue with abortion, rather the motivations behind it. For example, if you go into an area where they tend to abort gays and women, that may correlate with some bad attitudes towards gays and women. However, despite what I've just said, I think IP actually does have a good point here, because reading through the articles he showed during this segment of the video, these people do seem to be in conflict. As the first article mentions, the World Health Organization considers sex-selective abortion of female fetuses to be an act of violence against women. Now isn't that interesting? This pretty clearly implies that fetuses, or female fetuses, are women whose well-being we should be concerned about, which would contradict the rest of their publications on abortion that I've seen. Okay, at this point I think that's all he and I really wanted to say on this topic, so see you next time.